This is Andrea Kolsky, and you're listening to Justice is Blonde on Lone Star Community Radio. And today is the 27th of December. So Merry Christmas to all the listeners and happy 2018 coming around the corner. Today, we are super excited to be joined by power lawyer, recurring guest, superstar, Sean Buckley.
Hi, Andrea. Thanks for having me. And please excuse my laryngitis, holiday laryngitis.
You're screaming for a great year that you've had. Is that what this is all about?
I think that's how it happened, yes.
So you really have had an amazing year, and the listeners are going to get to hear a pretty heroic story about how you basically saved somebody's life. Now, they weren't on death row, but essentially the quality of life for this Woodlands man was something that you were fighting for, and his freedom was what you were fighting for over the last year and a half or so. And so 2017 was a pretty amazing year for you.
We had a great year, Andrea, and the man you're referring to is Larry Davis, who is the father and husband from the Woodlands, who was falsely accused in the Dominican Republic. For your listeners who may not have been there before, it's a Caribbean nation south of Cuba, near the Virgin Islands, out in that direction, Puerto Rico, falsely accused of smuggling 985 kilograms of pure cocaine, which is about a ton.
So before we get to the end, which is your victory lap that you did for Mr. Davis, let's talk about kind of the horror story that brought him to be kind of in your contact and how you came to be in contact with Mr. Davis. So first off, he's about our age, right? Mid-40s.
Yeah. In his prime.
And he's got a couple kids, living a pretty good life. He's in the Woodlands where we both have an office and working hard, right?
Right. He and his father had been in a fuel trading business since 2008.
Pretty successful.
Together. Right. Doing fine, doing well.
And so certainly us in Texas, fuel, oil, we're pretty passionate about that down here. So that wouldn't be an unusual business to get involved in.
Nothing unusual at all. And in fact, there were a lot of opportunities in the Caribbean to transport fuel among the different countries and make a profit.
And so isn't it interesting that Mr. Davis basically, like a lot of people who are self-employed or what have you, you have something personal come up and you have to direct your attention to something besides your business.
Right. And in this case, Larry's mother was diagnosed with a form of cancer that the doctors believe was terminal. And as it turned out, it was, in fact. So Larry and his father decided to put the fuel trading business on hold for a little while so they could spend their time in their mother and wife's last days.
So essentially, they have this successful business. They're working together. Also, part of the American dream is you're going to work with your parents if you like your parents.
Exactly.
And I think both of us do also still like our parents. So that's good. But in this case, Larry had basically made this very solid move as a son and as a father, great role model to say, you know what, I'm going to put the business on hold and I'm going to focus on family.
Exactly. And so what they did was they decided to lease out their main fuel trading vessel, which was named the Precon Express 1, about 168-foot vessel that they used to transport fuel. And they decided to lease it out to someone else so they could still get revenue from it while Larry and his father were at home with their mother.
Basically like a rental boat, like you would rent any other piece of property, a vehicle, a boat, a house.
Sure. It was a standard, what they call, in maritime law, a dry lease. All they were leasing was the vessel. They weren't providing any staff, any other services. Here is the vessel. You pay us lease payments to use our vessel, and we wash our hands of it until we come back and want the vessel back.
Right, and then you expect the vessel to be returned in a similar condition that it was leased, and you certainly, if the vessel comes back in a different condition than you leased, then there's other remedies available, just like any other thing that you would lease.
Exactly.
So, that was the nature of the agreement. Was it a 6-month lease? Was it a year lease? What was the term of the lease?
I don't recall offhand, but I believe it was a year lease. It was long enough that would give the Davis family a significant time period to spend time together without having to worry about the lease coming up.
Was the revenue significant? Was it $10,000 a month? Was it 50?
Well, typically for a boat that size, the market rate is about $2,000 a day, and that's
Okay.
what this lease was. I mean, this is a very large vessel that would cost a substantial amount of money to acquire. And so if someone is leasing it and engaged in a lucrative business like fuel transport,
Right.
then the lease pays for itself, even at a high rate like that.
So essentially $60,000 a month is what the potential lease payments would be.
Right. And if anything happened to the boat, if there were any mechanical difficulties, of course, the Davises, as the owners of the boat, would handle that. So within that lease payment is a guarantee that the vessel will operate and that any repairs will be done if they need to be.
So how did the individual contact Larry Davis to determine that he wanted to lease this boat? Did he advertise it through some sort of
Well, that's a good question. And in this case, the fact is very important to the case. This was a person named Joseph Hines, who was from Honduras. And the Davis family, in the course of the fuel trading business over the years, had dealt with the Hines family before and knew them and trusted them. And the Hines family was one of the people that the Davises reached out to say, hey, do you have any interest in leasing this vessel? Because they felt comfortable that the vessel would be in good hands.
And so it wasn't certainly a situation where they posted an ad out on Craigslist and
Right.
anything along those lines. It was they acquired the leasee through contacts and through personal relationships that they had built over their practice. And they had every reason to believe that the person leasing the boat was going to not only pay the lease, but do what they expected them to with the vessel.
Right. And implicit in that, of course, is that they're using the vessel for some lawful purpose, not drug trafficking.
Right, exactly. So certainly at the time they entered into the lease, they had no idea or expectations that there would be anything nefarious or any foul play
Right.
going on. They just were focused on staying with the family.
Exactly. And in fact, every expectation was to the contrary, that everything would be lawful.
And so did they pay the full term of the lease up front, or was it a they paid as the lease came up, they paid every 30 days?
I believe it was a 30-day increment or installment. I don't recall exactly, but it would not have been paid in advance. It would have been paid as time goes by, which would also reflect the revenue stream of the person who was leasing the vessel.
Well, and certainly, as a side note, it would be difficult to evict somebody for not paying a lease on a leased vessel versus a house where you could show up and try to evict them.
There are actually ways that you can do it. And I've learned a lot about maritime law and about the practical side of managing vessels. You can use any number of databases and punch in the ship's name and find out where it is. Anywhere in the world, any ocean, they'll tell you whether it's ported, whether it's at sea. And if it's ported, you can get an order with that country to seize the vessel if there's an ownership or arrearage issue
Over the lease payments,
Right.
or what have you. So this was not at all a luxury vessel as far as the people on the vessel would not be hiring a crew for boating or
Right.
skiing or anything along those lines. It's specifically,
I would say the only luxury is not drowning.
okay, so it has to be seaworthy
Right.
and it can transport a high volume. Is that fair to say?
Yes, a high volume of diesel fuel.
Okay. Not cocaine, which is ultimately what the vessel was used for.
Well, apparently it can transport
Right.
a high volume, but that was certainly not the intent.
That was not the intent. Okay, so just to kind of get the folks who are listening to understand, and before we take a break, Larry Davis, father, family man, he's got 2 kids. He has a sick mom, in business with his dad, decides to lease out his vessel and seafaring vessel where he used to transport fuel to Mr. Joseph Hines.
Joseph Hines.
Okay, and we'll get to what's going on with Joseph Hines next. But when he makes this lease payment, when he makes this lease agreement with Joseph Hines, things go wrong.
Almost immediately.
Almost immediately after he received his first payment. And he's trying to spend time with his sick mother who has some dire health issues. He
He he returns home to be with his family at the end of 2015. Early 2016, almost right away after the new year, he is at home with his family in the Woodlands, gets a call from Dominican authorities through a shipping contact that he had there and said, look, your vessel has been impounded and seized, and law enforcement is involved, and we want you to come down and discuss it with us.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a break to hear from our sponsors, and we're going to hear back after the break about what happened after Larry Davis, also known as Harold Larry Davis from the Woodlands, received a phone call from the Dominican Republic regarding his vessel. You're listening to Justice is Blonde on Lone Star Community Radio. You can hear us on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. And if you tune in after the break, you're going to hear what happened next to Larry Davis with esteemed defense attorney Sean Buckley.
It's no big deal. It's no big deal. It's no big deal. This is no big deal.
Don't forget to download the Lone Star Community Radio app for your Google Play or Apple Store. Bring Montgomery County's community radio with you anywhere with your smartphone or tablet. If you are in the Conroe area, tune in on FM. That is Conroe's FM 104.5, 106.1.
This is Andrea Kolsky, and if you're just joining us, you're listening to Justice is Blonde on Lone Star Community Radio. And we're joined again by esteemed published author, federal criminal defense attorney, author of O'Connor's Federal Criminal Rules and Codes, and may I say, a great author at that. What a great publication.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks again for having me on.
How many what year are we in the publication? Are we in the 4th edition, the 5th edition?
We started in 2010, so we are coming up on 8. I just finished the edits on number 8.
The 8th edition of the O'Connor's Federal Criminal Rules and Codes. So every time something new comes in the federal world, you're a part of putting it in your book.
It goes in the book because our book is designed for lawyers who practice in federal court to use the book as a quick reference to resolve legal issues that we all might not know off the top of our head.
And the nice thing about your book is that it breaks it down with current case law and really gets the lawyer streamlined with the cutting edge of everything that's happening in the federal courts across the country.
Right. That's our goal is not just to state what the rule is, but to give some background about how the courts have resolved the different conflicts that might come up in a courtroom so that the lawyers can have that quick reference.
So in addition to your authorship and your skills there, you're also a very well-trained and successful criminal defense lawyer in the courtroom.
I'm glad that I didn't have to pay you to say that. Well, I've been doing this almost 20 years.
You have a lot of success, and I've had the opportunity to know you for the last 2 decades, and you've just made a great difference in a lot of people's lives. And if you're just joining us with this portion of the show, the person that we're talking about whose life I know you really touched and is going to remember you forever from 2017 is a young man, middle-aged. I'd like to consider us still young, so
right.
youngish man named Larry Davis.
Generation Xer.
Generation
Larry Davis.
Youngish. Larry Davis. And Mr. Davis, if you're just joining us, was engaged in a contract, legitimate lease to lease his boat so he could take care of his sick mother, to another individual who had different expectations for that boat. And what happened was that he got a call from the Dominican authorities. He didn't think anything of that phone call, did he?
No, and none of us really know who was responsible for putting drugs on this boat. We have our theory, and our theory is Joseph Hines, the one who leased the boat from him, must have been involved, but none of us know. So going back to your lead-in, Larry was at home with his family over the new year of 2016, received a call from Dominican authorities via a shipping agent, said, we have your boat impounded and seized, and there's a problem, there's law enforcement involved, and we want to talk to you about it. So had Larry had any knowledge that the boat was being used for illegal purposes, or if he had had any involvement in drug smuggling, Well, of course he wouldn't have gone down there after receiving a phone call like that.
And certainly, if he thought that there was anything that resembled foul play or that resembled something that could be a criminal problem, he wouldn't have showed up without an attorney.
Right. But instead, because he's responsible, because he's always done honest and clean business, fuel trading business in the Caribbean for almost a decade, he immediately went down to address the Dominican authorities' concerns about the boat.
So basically, it was almost a bait and switch where they say, come in, we're having some problems with the boat. He books a round trip ticket. Am I correct?
He books a round trip ticket. And I'm not even sure I'd call it a bait and switch in the sense that they didn't really tell him one thing. They just left out the part that there were drugs found on the boat. But they were clear that there was a law enforcement issue during an inspection of the boat. So Larry full well knew when he went down there that law enforcement had some kind of issue with the boat.
And nonetheless,
He
him
went.
being in the Woodlands area knows that I haven't done anything wrong. I'm going to go down there and address whatever the issues are and resolve them quickly and get back to my mom
Right.
and family.
Well, the boat was a significant asset for his family's business. And his concern was, well, if they've seized our vessel, that's our asset. I need to go down and resolve whatever concerns they have about the vessel so that we can get it operating again.
And certainly, if you have this vessel, which you indicated in the earlier portion of the show, that has the capacity or capability of making your family $2,000 a day in revenue, less whatever payments are owed on the boat and less whatever the operating costs are, that's a significant amount of money that you would be losing while the docks, the boat stays in port, useless essentially.
Sure. And anytime you have a vessel that is seized by a foreign government, you always have to be cognizant that this government may have its own rationale for wanting to keep the vessel. And so you always want to be proactive in addressing whatever the beef is from the government so that they don't seize it and take it.
And certainly you not being there would be a significant value to the government as to why they would seize it.
Well, there's certainly an argument that it's been abandoned if
Right.
no one shows up. But of course, if you're a drug smuggler and you're dealing in the type of quantities that we're discussing here, a boat of this type would be an easy write-off.
So now let's visit about what was when he shows up. And I know that we talked about it. There's quite a bit of cocaine and there's also some heroin that's on the boat. And we'll get to that bombshell here shortly. But when they get there, does Larry have any idea that he's in trouble or that things are heading south?
None whatsoever. But he appears at the dock. He sees law enforcement activity around the boat. They ask him to stay in town. Don't leave. The old thing from the old film noir cop movies here in the U.S. Don't leave town. And so he doesn't. He sticks around, talks to the U.S. consulate there in Santo Domingo, the capital, and retains a local lawyer. They're communicating with the police. What do you need from us? What's this about? He reads in the newspaper one morning that this is a drug bust on the boat, and that's the first he hears of it.
So the first he hears that his boat is involved in any foul play is when he reads it in a local newspaper.
Yes, on the front page.
Is his name mentioned in that newspaper?
I don't recall if it was or not, but it was obvious which boat they were talking about. They did name the vessel.
Okay, so now wasn't there something that happened at the dock where the leasee was actually there and operating as a translator?
Yes, and it became an issue later during the court proceedings about whether Larry had made any statements that would be seen as admitting knowledge or admitting guilt or involvement. And the only one, he doesn't speak Spanish, and Dominicans speak almost exclusively Spanish. And the only one who was acting as a translator between Larry and the officials who were interrogating him was Joseph Hines, who had leased the boat from Larry and who we largely suspect may have been involved in the drug smuggling.
Well, he certainly has a lot closer ties to the boat and its contents than somebody that's in the Woodlands trying to take care of a sick mother.
Sure, it was under his control at the time of this activity.
Well, it's very suspicious that they would allow someone who is basically essentially a co-defendant, even in their own version of the events, to translate from one language to another language, that would never happen in the United States. Or if it did, it would never be admissible or used as evidence. That would be shocking.
The Dominicans have a much more flexible set of procedures for interviewing suspects and collecting evidence than we do here in the United States. And it was challenging to deal with that.
So let's talk about this. So they show up at the dock. They're using this person who leased the dock as a translator about
Who leased the boat?
Who leased the boat to talk about the goings on. And what, according to your later investigation, do you find out this is the leasee, Mr. Hines, says that your client said or knows?
The big issue became who had control over the boat and whether and what type of lease it was. It was what they call a dry lease. Larry had no control over the boat during the time that it was leased to Joseph Hines. And we believe that in that translation there on the dock with authorities, Joseph Hines mistranslated to give authorities the impression that Larry was acknowledging, hey, yes, I control this boat during this time period.
Basically, what Mr. Hines wanted authorities to think was all the shots and strings were pulled by Larry Davis.
That's right.
And even though he had a clear altruistic motive for not transporting fuel anymore, they believed the translation because they only received the information from the person who was most likely responsible for everything.
Right. Now, I don't think at the end of the day that was the real critical point about why the Dominicans chose to proceed forward against Larry. I think that there were a number of factors. One of them is that he's, what would be termed there a gringo, an American. And the Dominicans are very hospitable people. I really enjoyed the time that I spent down there and would love to go back.
Unless we're talking about your visits to the jail, which we
Right.
can talk about that
Right.
also. I hear that that's not the most luxurious place you've ever visited some clients.
That's true. However, in Dominican politics right now, there is a push to rid the country of corruption, particularly in this widespread belief that foreign drug dealers can buy their way out of problems, whereas the local poor get stuck doing time in prisons.
Or they get stuck as the middleman or somebody in
Right.
between.
So Larry Davis was, in essence, became a political pawn to some people, is my theory. A professional, educated gringo who was an easy target.
So the other interesting thing about this is that the person who ultimately leased the boat, who was operating as the translator, who was, by all purposes in control of the crew, who was hired, everything, the day-to-day operations of the boat, that person was ultimately released. Is that correct?
Well, he was never detained, and by the time they decided they wanted to detain him, he was nowhere to be found. And to my knowledge, he remains a fugitive.
So we dial it back to 2016. Is that
Yes.
right? The beginning of 2016, kind of end of February, early March?
That's when Larry Davis was detained by Dominican authorities at the airport on his way out to leave on his round trip ticket in March of 2016.
So the beginning of March 2016, he goes there on a routine check. What he perceives as, hey, they asked me to be here, I'll be here. Doesn't suspect at the time he gets there until he reads the paper that there's foul play. And ultimately, when you say he's detained, he's not just stuck in a room and interrogated. He's stuck in a jail, right?
And not only a jail, but they don't particularly distinguish in the DR, Dominican Republic, between pretrial detention and post-conviction detention. So he was put in a prison with people serving long sentences.
So what's interesting about what you say is that they don't distinguish, because here in the United States, at least as far as in the law that we practice, if someone is arrested on a misdemeanor, a felony, awaiting trial, they are put in a jail.
Right.
And I always tell people, jail is temporary, prison is permanent.
Right.
And so what's interesting about that is whenever, you have these celebrities that are incarcerated and they do 3 days in jail, the media likes to report that they're in prison. And I always have to make a correction.
Right.
They're not in prison. Prison is temporary. Prison is not temporary. Prison is permanent.
Prison is also a more salacious sounding term or harsh sounding term. that gets people's attention. But in this case, it was accurate.
In this case, you blend the two institutions, which is really, you get the worst criminals also in there with folks that, like your client, who actually did nothing wrong.
Yeah, and it was kind of a mixed bag about his experience there. He's a man of faith, and his faith, I think he would tell you, is what got him through this ordeal over the course of over a year.
Well, I think probably the faith in his amazing criminal defense attorney, Sean Buckley, is if we want to put faith in something, I know that he had faith in you. And we do need to take a break to hear from our sponsors. But when we come back, we're going to hear about not only Larry Davis's detention in a Dominican Republic jail/prison, the year plus of his life that he lost awaiting charges for something that he didn't do, but ultimately what happened to the Woodlands man who was charged with possession and trafficking of 985 kilos of cocaine, as well as a bunch of heroin.
4 kilos of heroin.
So almost 100 kilos or kilograms of drugs. It's an amazing story, and you'll hear back from attorney Sean Buckley after the break. You're listening to Justice is Blonde on Lone Star Community Radio.
Yeah, we do it like that. This is how we do. This is how we do.
Lone Star Community Radio is Montgomery County's radio station with talk, music, weather, and traffic for Montgomery County. Have a question or comment about one of our shows? Just contact the station on irlonestar.com or call in and leave a message at 936-647-3776. Get involved with your community with Lone Star Community Radio.
This is Andrea Kolsky, and you're listening to Justice is Blonde on Lone Star Community Radio. And you can find us at Justice is Blonde at irlonestar.com/Justice is Blonde. And we're on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. on Conroe's FM 104.5 and 106.1. And you can also find us worldwide and on the Lone Star Internet Radio app, Lone Star Community Radio. If you're just joining us, we're here still with Sean Buckley, esteemed, great trial lawyer, federal lawyer, author, and he's telling us a heroic story about his defense of a Woodlands man named Larry Davis, who was stuck in the Dominican Republic, went there to check on a lease of a vessel that he had leased to someone that he knew. And when he got there, he opened his eyes to the next year and a half of a nightmare that he got to deal with, which is they found that there was 985 kilos of cocaine, pure cocaine, and 4 kilos of heroin.
Right. Street
Not
value.
what he expected to see.
No, not at all. Street value on that, by the way, is at least $100 million.
So we talked about this at the break, is kind of calculating the value of all these drugs that were seized by the government here. So what happens is when you're calculating the value, at least, what we do is when you're determining what the value is you take a gram of cocaine and we give that value $100. And that's how you calculate kind of the street value of what that would be worth.
Right.
And then, so with 1 kilo, if the folks are listening, they may not be as familiar with the drug terminology as we are. That's 1,000 grams, 1 kilogram.
Right.
And so you take that, and that's $100,000 per kilo. Is that about right?
I believe that's right.
And then you multiply that out times, excuse me, that's per kilogram. And
That's
then,
right. 985.
so then we came up with a street value of at least the cocaine of $98 million, $98.5 million. And that's before the heroin.
And the heroin is going to be much more, not in quantity, but in value per volume.
And so the other interesting thing about drugs, and certainly a lot of the listeners are not drug users, and so that's a good thing. But what happens is when you have pure drugs, there's a way that the users that are the end consumers or the salespeople along the middle way make money, and that's doing what to the drugs?
Well, they cut it or they mix it with other items like even things like baking soda or
Things that have less value.
things that have less value. Sure, almost anything.
And so certainly the end quantity of this cocaine, if it had made it into the distribution network of where it was intended to go, it could have been 4 or 5 times that value.
Sure.
Ultimately, when it ended up in possibly our country, whatever country it was destined for.
Sure.
So a hugely significant fine by the Dominican Republic authorities to find this quantity of drugs traveling out of their country or possibly into their country.
It's an enormous amount of drugs in one place at one time.
And certainly in the United States, if this amount of drugs had been found and a client called you and said, hey, Sean, can you represent me? What would their sentencing guideline range be on a federal level?
Well, if they were convicted and if they were held accountable for all of those drugs, that would be a life sentence on paper.
So, and isn't it interesting that normally in the federal sentencing guidelines, there's a range of punishment?
The range in this case would be life to life.
So the range would be you can get life or you can get life.
Yeah, and on a side note, and not to belabor this point, but in federal court, that's why so many people become cooperating witnesses, is because they have no way out other than a life sentence for drug quantities. And the only way to get their numbers down and ever hope to get out again is to provide information and snitch on others with the FBI and other federal officials.
And then certainly with the federal government, if you cooperate and you provide accurate information, your hope is that your sentence would be reduced by a portion and
Sure.
obviously less than life in this case.
Sure. And, interestingly, and it's not necessarily fair, but it's true, that often the more involved you are in a drug conspiracy, the more of a reduction you can get because the more valuable your information is.
So certainly if you're at the top of a drug conspiracy and you can point to other players who are equally responsible or even more responsible, that
Right.
could minimize your sentence versus if you're somebody that's kind of a low level player and they don't really care as much about what you can offer.
Exactly.
But in this situation, Larry Davis was a no level player.
Right. He was an innocent man, and he is.
So he gets detained. He goes to this Dominican Republic facility, jail, prison. What's day to day in prison like for Mr. Davis?
Well, interestingly, he doesn't speak Spanish, and almost all of the other inmates only spoke Spanish. And so Larry got through on a day-to-day level mentally through his own Christian faith, is I think what he would tell you, but also by his own personal habits. He was a fanatic exercise aficionado and would they didn't have a weight room or anything like that, but he would make a weight dumbbells or barbells from items that he found around the prison. And he would run around the prison yard every day and exercise. And I think the other inmates left him alone because they thought he was just a crazy gringo because nobody else there did that kind of stuff.
So not only did he just keep believing, I'm going to get out one day, I'm going to do whatever it takes, I'm going to stay in shape. What was didn't he have, somebody had a medical issue in the Dominican Republic, how were they treated if you know?
They really, there wasn't a medical department unless somebody got sick, then they would summon a physician who may or may not have a legit medical degree. There was an occasion where, because of the drinking water scenario, it was polluted, a cholera outbreak where one of Larry's fellow inmates died.
So certainly that would be something that at least the ACLU and American folks and lawyers would be up in arms about, is that there was not a sustainable or quality drinking source of water at a prison.
Right.
But that was kind of the regular practice, was that the water was not certainly purified.
Well, they had to bring it in bottles. And I will say this, as a side note, the conditions in that Dominican prison were awful. And people often think, it's the Dominican Republic. What do you expect? They're not going to be like we are here. Our prisons and jails are so much better. But at the end of the day, I'm not so sure that Larry's experience was any worse in the Dominican Republic than it would have been if he had been in a state or federal prison or jail here. I think a lot of people really discount how bad it is to be incarcerated here in the United States.
Well, I mean, certainly the freedom to go run around and jog and do a
Right.
lap is something that most facilities here are not going to give you the liberty or the freedom to do.
Right.
So,
There was a certain humanity that I saw intact among the inmates there that I do not typically see here. They really, here in the United States, people are dehumanized and stamped with a number in this mass incarceration system that we have. And there, it was a horrific, a squalid environment, but the people seemed to remain human,
Dignified.
even to the people who were their guards and keepers.
So nonetheless, like you said, regardless of where you're incarcerated, when your freedom is taken away, it's absolutely devastating wherever you are.
Right.
And certainly when you're an innocent person who's facing decades, if not life in prison for something that you didn't do.
And Larry, and added to that, Larry, of course, is in the Dominican Republic, and he couldn't receive visits from his wife or his children. He could have, but the family by that point had become so concerned about the trustworthiness of the Dominican authorities that
They were afraid they would also
Right.
be detained, or who
Right.
knows what would have happened when
Right.
they got there.
right.
And interestingly and tragically, what started out as a way for Larry to spend time with his mother who was sick and dying, what happened to his mother when he was locked up?
His mother lost her battle with cancer while Larry was in prison, and she died not knowing whether her son would ever gain his freedom again. And Larry had to learn of her passing while he was in this environment, this alien, horrible, incarcerated environment
So just adding to his complete level of hopelessness.
with nobody to console him.
and without the ability to speak the language even.
Right, and showing emotion in a place like that is a sign of weakness and an invitation to be victimized.
Could be potentially dangerous.
Sure.
So just tragically, what started out as what he thought was a good business decision ended up being a certainly terrible situation for him. But you got involved. You also worked with the local council. What was the justice system like down there? What
Well,
was the battle like down there?
It's very interesting. I came to have a respect and an appreciation for some parts of the Dominican system. They use panels of judges. The more serious the crime, the more judges who sit on the panel, as opposed to juries here in the United States.
So there's no system in the Dominican Republic that you're aware of where you can have a jury trial like you can in the United
There are
States?
no jury trials.
Okay.
And so people often here in the United States believe that jury trial is a superior system of assessing a person's criminal liability and their sentence. And first of all, I'm a very patriotic American, so I don't want my comments to be taken as a negative commentary on our country at all, because that's not my intention.
No, I don't think that there's any doubt that you're
But I look at
patriot.
it in terms of my analysis and commentary on how to set up a system. I have great concerns about whether the jury system is accurate and whether it's effective.
Well, I know you've been on the show before, and interestingly enough, one of the shows that you did before, you were also involved in exonerating an innocent man. But this is an innocent man who was convicted and sent to prison and had spent nearly 2 decades there before you actually were able to remove him from prison and get him acquitted that way.
Right. And so that was an example of the jury system failing. But in the Dominican Republic, there's another problem. While the judges may be more experienced in the judicial system and better able to assess what's really going on in a case and get to the meat of it, they are also political appointees. And in a country that does struggle with some governmental corruption, that can be troubling. So you have in the Dominican Republic a system that may have a superior level of expertise applied to the determination of guilt or innocence and punishment, but a great weakness in terms of whether it's reliable for other reasons.
So in this case, 985 kilos worth of cocaine, 4 kilos of pure heroin. How many judges do they staff for this trial?
3 judges, the maximum amount at a trial court.
So you have 3 judges, and does Mr. Davis have the benefit of a translator?
Yes, he has
Okay.
a translator. In this case, the court provided translator was not very good, but the lead judge understood and spoke English. She would actually correct the translator from time to time. That's not what he said.
Which is interesting because it's kind of the bad translation, which is what was part of the
Right.
reason that he got detained to begin with.
It was a systemic challenge throughout this case.
And you know what happens, and I've had this happen in trials that I've had here in Montgomery County, is I represented an individual that was charged with capital murder. And when the translator translates here in the United States, they take an oath to translate fair and correctly. So even if the translation is wrong, the jury, and if they do speak Spanish, the jury is sworn to abide by the sworn translation because the translator takes an oath that they're translating correctly. So as a lawyer, I've found it challenging because I've had to object to the translator's translation when it came down to a critical point as to whether my client was either given an instruction or a party to this aggravated robbery, which ultimately allowed it to be a capital murder. And the translator, in my opinion, was not accurately translating. And unfortunately, the laws that we have don't allow somebody to say, you can say that it's wrong, but the jury is instructed to follow the sworn translation. So that would be at least when you have somebody that speaks English, that is a fact finder and decision maker, that's great that they're able to come in and do that. So that would be
and it was necessary in this case because the translation was in some cases so deficient.
And possibly so inaccurate that it could have.
The main problem we had was that Larry had a lot of very detailed information to provide and a lot of very meaningful explanations for the decisions that he made along the way. And the translator was not doing an adequate job at conveying those details and the real nuances of his explanations. But the lead judge was picking it up, and I believe that she was explaining it to the other judges on the panel.
So we're going to take a break to hear from our listeners. And at the when we come back after the break, we're going to hear about how that trial and the fight for Larry Davis's life ended and how he ultimately was able to leave the Dominican Republic a free man, and how you were able to be integral in his freedom, as well as the freedom of so many accused folks. You're doing a great job for the citizens, the accused citizens of not only the United States, but folks of the United States that end up in other countries. So we're really proud to have you as a member of the Defense Bar.
Thank you.
You're listening to Justice is Blonde on Lone Star Community Radio.
This is no big deal. This is how we do. Yeah, chillin' back streets.
Don't miss Lone Star Community Radio on TV and YouTube. Our talk show and music shows are featured on Our City TV, Suddenlink Channel 12, and have their own YouTube channel. Make sure to subscribe to keep up with posted shows and comment on them below the video.
This is Andrea Kolsky, and you're listening to Justice is Blonde on Lone Star Community Radio. And at the break, we heard from some listeners and got some messages from some listeners about just the disbelief about what happened to this Woodlands man. How did this happen? How can this be prevented? And we're here with Sean Buckley talking about how he helped free Larry Davis, who was a Woodlands man charged with smuggling, trafficking, nearly 1,000 pounds of drugs out of the Dominican Republic. What happened with that trial when it eventually took place, Sean?
2,000 pounds of drugs, almost 1,000 kilos.
That's right. Excuse me. Almost 1,000 kilos. Thank you for the correction.
I don't want to minimize the
volume.
the volume.
We talked about it before the break. At least $100 million worth of drugs.
Yeah. So anyway, the trial ended in an acquittal. Larry went to.
We call that a two-word verdict, not guilty.
Verdict, right. And
Those
Larry went to trial with some of the others who were on the ship at the time the boat was detained. They were convicted and sentenced to terms of 5 years in prison due to their clear connection with the drugs. Larry was acquitted and immediately allowed to leave the country.
Well, what's interesting is for that volume of drugs, you were saying at the break that somebody here in the United States would be facing a life-to-life sentence. How did those other individuals only get 5 years?
You know, I think that there are a number of factors that go into it. On one hand, as I alluded to earlier before the break, I think there is a greater humanity in the criminal justice system in the Dominican Republic than there often is here in the United States. People really want vengeance and punishment here. And there it's more of a kind of political economic decision of, well, we have a problem in society. How do we curtail it? And I didn't see the type of vengeance feelings of vengeance and persecution displayed.
Well, certainly the folks that ultimately got the shorter sentences, those folks they didn't suspect were the masterminds or know were they involved in the the planning of the $100 million victory. I'm sure they were poor folks.
Yeah, they were
local
just
folks
working on the boat, and that was their paid job, and nobody claimed that they got any cut of the action. By action, I mean the drugs.
The drugs.
So it was a very interesting trial, and the rules of evidence there are much looser. If you want to put a document into evidence, you just hand in the document. You don't have to do what we call authenticating or establishing any kind of predicate or foundation for it. As long as somebody's there to testify about what it is, it comes in. And hearsay is often admissible, even if it seems unreliable. So that can cut both ways.
And that's interesting too, is that oftentimes, or unless there's an exception in the courts around the United States, if you want to offer something that somebody else said, unless it meets an exception, it's not generally admissible.
Right. And I think part of the reason for that is because they don't have a jury system. When you have a jury system, you have to have very strict rules for what the jury can consider and how. And there, I think the philosophy is, well, everything comes in and the judge is sophisticated enough in the legal system to either ignore it or assess some level of weight to it.
Right. They can say this statement seems not credible because it came from what somebody said
Right,
versus, the jury could just say, well, this is what we heard and not know the rules. And once they hear it, they can't unhear it.
Right, exactly. Or not have the legal insight to understand why it shouldn't be given as much weight as another statement or a statement to the contrary.
So not only did Larry Davis get to go home, what happened with his boat? Did he ultimately get his boat back?
Well, the boat is still in the Dominican Republic. There's a civil action. The judges ordered the boat released, but that's still pending. So we're working on it.
Okay, so ultimately he's free. His boat's still there, but certainly when it comes time to go back and pick the boat up, is it realistic to say that Mr. Davis probably won't be the one going to pick it up?
Someone else will. I've volunteered to go do it, but I need someone to drive it because I don't know.
You don't know how to captain a boat.
Right. Nor am I licensed to do so.
Nor are you licensed to do so. But you feel confident that you plus someone who's able to master a vessel would be able to get it out of the Dominican Republic when that time comes.
Yeah, I think it'd be fun little junket to take down there to pick up this boat and sail it to Panama or somewhere.
What is going on with Mr. Davis now that he's back? Is he a changed man? Has it ultimately completely changed the course of his life? What's he doing business-wise now? Is he working on a book?
Well, I don't think he's a changed man in the sense of who he is. I think he's still a strong man of his faith and his beliefs. He has become even a stronger father to his family, I think, realizing what it's like to be away from them. This is not someone who has damaged goods.
He was a great guy to begin with. He's still a
guy.
super guy. It's just he maybe doesn't take every day for granted.
I think so. And he may not travel internationally as much, realistically. But no, I think Larry is going to be just fine. He is thinking about what he wants to do business-wise, dabbling in a couple things. He's very entrepreneurial, so he won't have trouble doing that. He formerly traded on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange before going to work with his father. So he's a smart guy.
Maybe he can give you some advice on whether to buy Bitcoin.
Right. I'm staying away from Bitcoin, but that's a good idea.
So you would take his advice if he told you to stay away from it. I'm
Certainly,
saying he's
yeah.
somebody that you would
Right.
trust may have some
Right.
good brains and knowledge about that. Well, Sean, we so much appreciate having you on the show, Justice is Blonde, today, right after Christmas. I know it was a great year for you, and I know you have another exciting thing that you're working on, and you were also integral from another. So this case, you're helping an accused citizen as far as a defendant's rights. You're freeing an innocent person. That's got to feel so good. But another big fight that you've had in 2017 and end of 2016 is you actually helped a victims' rights bill come into place and change the course of how victims are dealt with based on your defense of a victim who was also incarcerated. I mean, talk about people that shouldn't be incarcerated. You actually were integral in helping and are still on board helping with a victim that was a rape victim.
Yeah, that was a very gratifying project to work on, and it remains so.
And so we hope that we can hear in the future from you about Jenny's Law and how you were able to single-handedly ultimately get rights for victims that weren't previously in place. And just another great job by Sean Buckley is helping not only the accused citizens, but any citizens of the great state of Texas and the United States in this case. So we're really happy to have you on the show, Sean. You're doing a great job. Keep fighting the great fight and keep justice blonde.
Thanks, Andrea. I'll dye my hair before I come back next time.
Just some highlights, perhaps.
Okay, got it.
Happy New Year. You're listening to Justice is Blonde on Lone Star Community Radio. And if you happen to find yourself at the wrong holiday party and in the backseat of a patrol car, call 4A Discount Bail Bonds at 936-539-4444. They will unhook you up and get you back to your friends and your family.